Hi, everyone, and welcome to the last lecture of the semester. We're going to be talking about helping behavior, altruistic behavior today. But before we jump into the course material, I want to give you a couple stories. In 1995, in Detroit, a 33-year-old woman was coming home from a night out. This is about 2 in the morning or so. And she's crossing a bridge when she gets into a minor accident, just a little bit of a fender bender. She hits the car in front of her, no big deal. Her name is Dalitha Word. The person she hits, his name is Martell Welch Jr. And even though it's only a minor fender bender, Martell Welch Jr. is extremely angry. He's infuriated that he has been hit. And so he gets out of his car and he goes to Dalitha Word's car and he starts yelling at her. And he opens her door and he grabs her and he pulls her out of the car, in the process, ripping off some of her clothes. And he's berating her and he takes her head and he starts smashing it into the hood of her car. And this goes on for a while, this berating, this beating, this yelling at her. And then at some point, he goes back to his car. He opens up the trunk and he grabs a tire iron. And he returns and he says he's going to delete the word with the tire iron. Now, delete the word decides that rather than face her attacker, she decides that her chances are going to be better if she jumps off the bridge, which she does, into the waters below. Now, she's barely conscious at this point, right? She survived a beating and a jump off the bridge. But she's still alive, but she's at huge risk of drowning in the waters below because she's only semi-conscious because of the fact that she's been beaten. And around this time, two men come across the scene. They see her struggling in the waters. And when they see her struggling, they take off their shoes and jackets. They jump in after her and they try to rescue her. But Dalitha Word, again, because she's probably in a bit of a haze, probably thinks these people are coming to attack her some more, and she tries to get away from them. And as a consequence, she slips under the waters and drowned. That's a horrific story in and of itself. But what makes it even more surprising, I guess, is that while this attack took place, which took place over the course of about 10 to 20 minutes, about 40 people watched this attack take place. In fact, the two men who jumped in to try to save her life did not witness the actual attack. They came across the scene later. None of those 40 people who saw this attack actually did anything to help delete the word, which later led her mother to exclaim, "I can't believe all those people stood around and watched." Unfortunately, this phenomenon whereby someone's in obvious need of help and no one actually intervenes, no one does anything to help, is not uncommon. This happens over and over. I'll give you another example. This is a famous example from social psychology. This is Kitty Genovese. She was a 28-year-old bartender in 1964 in New York, and she was coming home after a shift one night. It's about 3:20 in the morning or so, and she parks her car in her apartment complex's parking lot. She starts walking towards the entrance, and there's a silhouette of a man that she notices behind her, and he starts following her. And as she walks a little bit faster, she hears the footsteps get a little bit faster as well. So she starts running, and she hears the footsteps running behind her until this man grabs her and picks her up, and he pulls out a knife and he stabs her in the back. Now, Kitty Genovese is seriously injured, obviously, and she lets out a scream. And because of that, someone in the apartment complex opens a window and says, "Leave that girl alone." And the attacker drops her and he takes off. Now, Kitty Genovese is seriously injured, but she's not fatally wounded. And so she starts dragging herself to the lobby, to the entrance of her apartment complex. And when she gets there, she opens the door and collapses inside, almost unconscious. But a few minutes later, her attacker comes back. You see, he had set out that night to try to find a random person to kill, and he hadn't finished the job yet. And he notices the blood trail that Kitty Genovese has left as she's been crawling towards the lobby of the apartment complex. And he follows that and he sees her lying semi-conscious inside this lobby area. And he attacks her again. He stabs her. He sexually assaults her and he steals $49 from her and then takes off. All in all, this attack took place over the course of something like 30 or 40 minutes. But the first call to police didn't go in until about 2 minutes after her attacker had left. And the police and ambulance are there within a few minutes, and they rush Kitty to the hospital, but unfortunately, she dies along the way. In the investigation that followed, the detectives started interviewing people who lived in that apartment complex, and what they found astonished them. Because what they discovered is that 38 people saw or heard some part of the attack at some point. And yet, for those 30 or 40 minutes that the attack was taking place, no one called the cops. It's sometimes falsely claimed that 38 people saw the entire murder. It's not what happened, but they saw or heard some part of it. And yet no one called the police until 2 minutes after the attacker left. Again, we're seeing the inaction of people when someone's in obvious need of help. And how do we explain this? When the story broke, people were quick to say this just shows that in modern society, we have lost our ability to care for each other. We've lost our ability to empathize with other. We just don't care about people anymore. But two social psychologists had a bit of a different interpretation of what was happening. They sat down and they figured that if we're blaming people's personality for their inaction, well, that should sound familiar to you. That should sound a little bit like the fundamental attribution error, the natural tendency we have to attribute other people's behavior to their personality. And these social psychologists were trained to think about how the situation might have affected their behavior as well. And they came up with a hugely influential model of helping that we're going to talk about at the end of this class. January 13th, 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 takes off from Washington, D.C. in the middle of a snowstorm. And the snowstorm is so bad that the pilots quickly lose control of the aircraft. And the aircraft crashes into a bridge over the Potomac River, killing most people instantly on board. But there are a handful of survivors. But these survivors are huddled around the only part of the plane which has fallen into the Potomac River, the only part of the plane that's still above the waters, which is the tail section of the plane. This is where the survivors are. But they're at serious risk of drowning and of hypothermia because the waters are freezing cold in January in Washington, D.C. So a rescue helicopter is called in. And this rescue helicopter has like one of those lifesavers attached to a rope. And it drops this lifesaver to the tail section. And a man who is particularly well off compared to everybody else grabs the lifesaver, but instead of taking it for himself, he gives it to someone else. And that person holds on to the lifesaver, and the helicopter drags them through the water to the bank and drops them off. It then returns to the tail section. And again, that same man grabs that lifesaver. And again, instead of taking it for himself, he gives it to someone else. And this process keeps repeating where this helicopter keeps taking one person at a time, dragging them from the tail section of the plane to the bank of the river. One of the people who grabs on to this lifesaver, her name is Priscilla Tirado, and she's just lost her husband and her newborn baby in this plane crash. And she's on the verge of death herself. In fact, she's so weakened that she can't hang on to the lifesaver. And in the process of her being pulled over to the bank, she lets go of the lifesaver. And unfortunately, now there's no tail section. There's no other survivors in sight to help her survive. So she's in the process of drowning in the Potomac River. Now, while this rescue operation has been happening, has been going on, people have been watching from the sides of the river. There's a big crowd formed to watch the rescue operations. And one of the people who's there, his name is Lenny Skutnik. And Lenny Skutnik, when he sees Priscilla Tirado fall into the water, he immediately takes his jacket off and dives in the freezing cold waters and swims out to her and holds her up and saves her life and pulls her back to the bank. He saved her life that day, risking his own life to save the life of a woman he's never met before. And meanwhile, the helicopter's still going back and forth, still trying to rescue survivors that are at the tail section. And every time it drops that lifesaver, the same man grabs it and he keeps giving it to other people to save those other people. And finally, when all those other people are saved, the helicopter goes back one last time to save that hero. And they drop the lifesaver. But unfortunately, that man is nowhere to be found. He slipped under the water and drowned that day. In fact, he is the only person who lost their life after the plane crash itself. He basically saved the lives of all the other survivors of that plane crash. And for a while, they didn't know who this person was. He was called the unknown hero. He was later discovered to be a person by the name of Arlen D. Williams. If you go to Washington, D.C., there is either a road or a bridge called the Arlen D. Williams. I think it's a bridge, the Arlen D. Williams Bridge. And that's named after this guy who saved the lives of all these strangers. And so if we contrast this situation where we've got two acts of extraordinary heroism, we've got Lenny Skutnik, who risked his life to save the life of Priscilla Tirado. You've got Arlen D. Williams, who saved the lives of all these other survivors at the cost of his own life. Contrast that to the first two stories we discussed, where people did nothing to help someone else. How do we explain those instances when someone provides help versus when they don't? We're going to look at a little bit of that today. 1996, a 3-year-old boy is at the Chicago Zoo, and he climbs over the barrier that separates the zoo goers from the gorilla enclosure below. He falls over that barrier, falling 20 feet to the concrete below, knocking himself unconscious. And this is horrifying enough, but the onlookers are even more horrified when they start to see gorillas approach this boy's lifeless body. They don't know what they're going to do to him when they get there. They're going to tear him limb from limb or what? And the first gorilla that gets there, her name is Binti, and she picks up this boy. And instead of tearing him apart, she instead cradles him in her arms, as you can see in this picture here. She takes him to the opening to the gorilla enclosure where the gates are, where the zookeepers can come in to take care of the gorillas. And she lays this boy's body in front of those gates and she backs off. And when other gorillas approach, she growls at them and keeps them at bay. And as a consequence, the zookeepers are able to get into the gorilla enclosure and save this boy's life. When this happened, Binti was called a hero, right? I mean, isn't this evidence that a non-human animal is showing empathy for another species? That's amazing, right? Well, that's one part of the story. An alternative account, though, developed because it turns out that Binti had recently gotten pregnant. And yet, when she was younger, she had been abandoned by her mother, and as a consequence, she had never learned how to take care of her own offspring. And so, in the months prior to this incident, the zookeepers had been training Binti on how to take care of her offspring. In particular, they trained her by giving her a doll, and they taught her to cradle this doll in her arms. They taught her that if anything was wrong with the doll, that she should go and take it to the gates of the gorilla enclosure and lay it down, and then back off so the zookeepers could get at it. And so the question is this: were Binti's actions that day a reflection of empathy, of true empathy for someone else? Or was Binti just acting out a series of learned behaviors? This question effectively mirrors one of the main questions that has occupied the thoughts of psychologists and philosophers and others, which is there such a thing as true altruism at all? Or is all these examples of helping behavior, of people behaving altruistically, is that just an illusion? And in fact, all of our behaviors are aimed at egoistic motives, at benefiting ourselves somehow. That latter perspective, this idea that even the most seemingly selfless acts are fundamentally selfish in nature, is the position taken by social exchange theorists. Now, we've talked about social exchange theory briefly already in this class in the section on attraction. And I mentioned at the time that social exchange theory is a broad theory that can be applied to all sorts of different areas in social psychology. It's the general theory, the general concept that whenever we have a decision to make, we will always choose the decision that maximizes our benefits and minimizes our costs. We want to maximize our rewards, in other words. And certainly there are all sorts of rewards that happen if you potentially choose to help someone. So, for example, if you see someone in need of help and you help them, you probably feel good about yourself for doing so, right? You get rewarded in that sense of feeling good for having helped someone. Or maybe you help someone because you know that you're going to be called a hero if you help them. And we like social approval. We like when other people like us. So we do it for those accolades, for that social approval. Or maybe you volunteer at a hospital because it looks good on a resume. It's going to help you get into graduate school. There's all sorts of rewards that are associated with helping. At the same time, there's all sorts of costs that are associated with helping as well. Maybe you want to help someone who is being mugged, but if you intervene, maybe they're going to turn the gun on you. You put your life in danger to help that person. There's potential harm there. Maybe you are walking down South Beach and you see someone passed out and you go to give them mouth to mouth. Turns out, though, they only fell asleep on the beach. That's kind of embarrassing if someone wakes up to you giving them mouth to mouth, right? Volunteering at a hospital is going to take some time away that you could otherwise spend doing things that you liked. Or maybe you're asked to donate money to give $1 to a homeless person downtown. And you give them $1 not because you feel empathy for them, but because you know that you will feel guilty for the next 20 minutes if you don't give them $1. And it's worth $1 to not feel that guilt. These are all the sorts of different rewards and costs that can factor into our decision making when deciding whether to help or not. And according to social exchange theorists, we will only help if the rewards we gain from helping outweigh the costs. So, in other words, helping is truly egoistic. There's no such thing as true altruism, as selflessness. Even the most helpful person, people have devoted their entire lives to helping the needy, for instance, probably feel good about what they've done. That might be enough of a reward, according to social exchange theorists, to keep them helping, to devoting their life to helping. So ultimately, according to these theorists, all helping is egoistically motivated. But that's only one perspective. There's a second perspective that other social psychologists have, who say that there is such a thing as truly altruistic behavior. And that concept that there is actual altruistic behavior forms the basis of what's known as the empathy altruism hypothesis. What this hypothesis states is that all helping is not self-serving, but in fact, there is helping that's truly altruistic, but only if we experience empathy for someone. When I say empathy, what I mean is the ability to put yourself into someone else's shoes, to see the world through their eyes. If we're able to do that, if we're able to experience vicariously the suffering this person went through, to really empathize with them that way, to imagine what it's like to be that person, then we can experience empathy for that person. And under those conditions, according to these researchers, if you feel empathy for someone, you're going to help them regardless of the rewards and costs. You're not going to do this cost-benefit analysis. So we can think of the empathy altruism hypothesis in terms of this diagrammatic form. Okay. So imagine that you observe someone who's in need of help, and the decision you have to make is, are you going to help them? Well, in order to understand if we're going to help them, we need to know, do you feel empathy for this person? Now, if you don't feel empathy for them, it doesn't mean you're not going to help necessarily. What it means, though, is that social exchange theory considerations are going to kick in. You're going to weigh the rewards and costs, and you're only going to help if the rewards outweigh the costs. So, in other words, if you don't feel empathy for someone, you will help them only if it benefits you in some way. There's an egoistic motive to helping. You help others because it helps ourselves. On the other hand, if you do feel empathy for that person, you don't weigh those pros and cons. You don't engage in that social exchange theory concept of this cost-benefit analysis. You're going to help them regardless of the rewards and costs. And so we would say that in this condition, your helping is altruistically motivated. It's not motivated at helping yourself. It's truly motivated at helping this other person, at alleviating their suffering. But we can't just claim this, right? Researchers can't just say that this is a theory. They have to test it. So how do they go about testing this idea? Well, here's how. I'm going to walk you through this from the perspective of a participant. So you show up to a lab, and I tell you that we're waiting on one more person. Her name is Elaine. She's another participant that's due to arrive any minute now. And while we wait for her, I'm going to give you some information about Elaine. See, a couple of months ago, you and a bunch of other people participated in this mass testing session where you answered a whole bunch of questions on a questionnaire. And so what I, as the researcher, am going to do for you as the participant, I'm going to show you Elaine's answers to her questions. So you get to learn a little bit about her. And so I give you a questionnaire packet that's been filled out supposedly by Elaine, and you go over it and you start reading about her. Now, in a couple of minutes, Elaine shows up. And the researcher places Elaine in a room, a small room that's adjacent to the small room that he's placed you in as well. Now, in your room, there's a TV monitor, which is hooked up to a video camera, a live camera, that's in the other room where Elaine is. So you can actually see Elaine and the researcher interact with one another. And so the researcher places Elaine in this other room, and he tells her that for the purpose of this experiment, because she is the second person that showed up to the study, she's the one that's going to be receiving some electric shocks. And your job as the participant, as the person who got there first, you're simply going to observe Elaine receive those shocks. And Elaine says, okay, I've had some issues with electricity in the past. And the researcher says, okay, well, I mean, if you're feeling uncomfortable, just let me know. And so you start to observe Elaine receive some electric shocks. And after a few shocks, she's in clear distress. She's in a lot of pain. She's very uncomfortable. And it's so obvious that the researcher can clearly tell as well, because you can see on your screen, you can see the researcher enter Elaine's room. And he says, look, I think I'm going to have to stop this study because you're clearly in a lot of pain. And Elaine says, no, I am in pain, I know, but I really, really want to continue with this study. And the researcher says, I just don't know. I don't know if we can go ahead. I don't like this because you're in a lot of pain. And he says, wait a second, I have an idea. And he leaves her room and he goes into your room. And he says, look, you've been watching what's been going on here, right? Elaine's received a bunch of shocks. She's obviously in a lot of pain, but she wants to continue. I'm not sure if we should, but I had an idea. You don't have to do this. You showed up first to this study, so you are the observer. But if you want to, you could choose to switch places with Elaine. That's going to be our measure of whether people help or not. Okay. Now, there's two things that are manipulated in the study. The first thing that's manipulated is whether you experience empathy for Elaine or not. And the way that's manipulated is that when you were given that questionnaire packet at the beginning of the study, before Elaine showed up, that was supposedly filled out by Elaine, in reality, it wasn't filled out by Elaine at all. Well, in reality, Elaine's not even a real participant. She's working with the experimenter, right? But what happened is that the researchers randomly assigned you to be given a questionnaire that was either very, very similar to yours or that was very dissimilar to yours. Because we know that when people are similar to us, it's a lot easier to experience empathy for them. So by manipulating how similar Elaine is to you, that's effectively a manipulation of how much empathy you feel towards Elaine. Second thing that's being manipulated is whether the participant is allowed to leave or not if they decide not to switch places with Elaine. What I mean is this. In the allowed to leave condition, this is sometimes called the easy escape condition. What the researchers say is that, look, you can choose to switch places with Elaine or not. It's up to you. If you don't want to switch places with her, we already have enough data from you observing her for the first few shocks. You don't have to stay for the rest of the study. You can actually just leave. In the not allowed to leave condition, or the difficult escape condition, as it's sometimes known, the researcher says you can choose to switch places with Elaine. If you choose not to switch places with her, you're still going to have to watch her receive the rest of the shocks. So basically, it's a manipulation of whether the participant has to watch Elaine receive the rest of the shocks if they decide not to switch places with her. And so the question is this: will participants help Elaine by switching places with her? I'm going to walk you through the results of this study, and then I'm going to explain how these studies or how the results relate to the empathy altruism hypothesis. So what we're looking at here is the percentage of people who decided to help Elaine by switching places with her as a function of whether they experienced empathy for her, so in other words, how similar she was to them, and as a function of how easy it was to escape the situation. And we're going to start with people who have high empathy for Elaine. Now, remember, according to the empathy altruism hypothesis, if you experience empathy for someone, then you should help her regardless. You're not going to be weighing the pros and cons. No other factor is going to matter. You're just going to tend to help that person. And in fact, that's exactly what we see in that condition. Between 80 and 90% of people help Elaine regardless. This difference here is not meaningful between difficult and easy escape conditions. Pretend it's not even there. The vast majority of people are helping Elaine. But now let's look in the low empathy condition. These are people who believe that Elaine is very different from them, and therefore they don't have a strong amount of empathy for her. Now, suddenly what you find is that overall helping is lower, but now there's a difference between the difficult escape and the easy escape conditions. In other words, the majority of people will still help Elaine in the difficult escape condition. These are the people who are told that if they don't switch places with her, they're going to have to watch her receive the rest of the electric shocks. But if you look at the people in the easy escape condition, the people who are told if you don't switch places with her, you can just leave, almost everybody decides to just leave and to not switch places with her. Almost no one helps Elaine. In other words, what's happening in the low empathy condition is that people are weighing the pros and cons of helping her. They're taking into consideration whether they can leave the study or not. Because if they can just leave the study, they don't have to really worry about Elaine receiving the electric shocks. They don't have to pay attention to it. It's not right in front of them. But in the difficult escape condition, if they didn't switch places with Elaine, they have to watch her receive the electric shocks. That's going to remind them that they decided not to switch places with her. In effect, it's partly their fault that she's receiving those electric shocks. And those people know that they're going to feel guilty. As a consequence, most of them decide to help Elaine, not because they care about her well-being, but because they know they're going to feel guilty if they don't switch places with her. So the main point here is that what these data are showing is that when you don't have empathy for someone, people start weighing the pros and cons of helping. That's what social exchange theorists say that we do. They start weighing whether they can leave the situation or not, and all these sorts of these factors. But if people do feel empathy for Elaine in the high empathy condition, they don't care about that stuff. They're not even considering whether they can escape the situation. They tend to help her regardless. And so that's why these data, according to these researchers, support the empathy altruism hypothesis. Now, this is somewhat controversial. Social exchange theorists have a very different interpretation of these data, and they actually say these data are consistent with their perspective. That issue is not resolved. It's a very, very tricky issue to actually resolve, to actually know what people's fundamental motivations are when helping. Is there actual true altruism or not? So I'll let you make up your own mind as to whether you think there's truly altruistic behavior in people, or whether all behavior is actually egoistic in nature. So let's spend the rest of the lecture talking about some situational influences that affect our likelihood of helping. And the first thing we're going to talk about is based on what I consider to be maybe the most ironic study in all of social psychology. Here's what they looked at. Some researchers wanted to look at the effect of time pressure on people's likelihood of helping. And so they conducted a study with theology students. These are like religious studies students who were training to become pastors and things like that. And so upon arrival at the lab, the researchers tell these participants that they're going to be giving an impromptu talk on the Good Samaritan parable from the Bible. Now, the Good Samaritan parable, there's a man who's injured in obvious need of help lying at the side of the road. And a priest walks by, who's a very high status person, and doesn't stop to provide help to this man in need. And then a Levite walks by, another high status person at the time, and again doesn't provide any help to this person in need. And it's not till a Samaritan comes by, who's a very low status person, that it's only the Samaritan that stops to provide help. And the lesson here, among other things, is that we should always help people. And it doesn't take a high status person to provide help. Even the low status people can provide help, right? But the point is that we should always be stopping to provide help to people if we can. And so these participants are led to believe that they're going to have to give an impromptu talk on the Good Samaritan parable. And they're told that this talk is taking place in a building across campus. And they're randomly assigned to one of two conditions. Half of these people are told they are early to give this talk. It's not starting for another half hour or so. Take your time getting over there. The other half of the participants are randomly assigned to a condition in which they're told this talk is starting in like 5 minutes. You've got to really rush to get over there. So there's a manipulation of time pressure there. Now, these participants start walking over to this other building and they're practicing this talk in their head. They're thinking about what they're going to say. And as they approach this building where they're going to give this talk, they encounter a man who is slumped against the side of the building and is coughing and groaning, is in obvious need of help, in other words. Now, this is someone who, of course, is working with the experimenter. And the question is, will these participants stop to provide help to this person? Now, if the participants believe that they were early to give a talk, then the majority of them did. Almost two-thirds of people stopped to give help to this person. But if they believed they were late to give a talk, that number dropped dramatically to only 10%. The vast majority of people who thought that they were late did not provide help to someone who was in obvious need. And I mentioned that this is the most ironic study in social psychology, right? Because you have to put yourself into the mindset of these participants. They're thinking as they're walking to this building, I need to teach people why we should always help others, right? We always need to help others. It's really important to always help others. Hey, there's someone who's in need of help. We should always help others. And they keep thinking about it and they don't even provide help to the person. That's why I consider this to be the most ironic study in social psychology, right? In fact, in another variation of the study, just to make sure that participants notice this person, the person in need of help was lying across the doorway of the building the participants had to enter. So in order to get into the building, the participants literally had to step over him to get into the building. And you still find this effect that among those people who thought they were late to give a talk, the majority of them did not help this person on their way to give a talk about how we should always help people. So time pressure matters, in other words. Another factor that matters is the mood you happen to be in when you encounter someone in need of help. There's certain moods that make us more likely to help. So for example, if you're in a happy mood, well, we like to maintain a happy mood. And one way to maintain that happy mood is to help other people. So when we're in a happy mood, we tend to be more likely to help others. There's a number of studies that are consistent with this. So in one, researchers stopped random people in a shopping mall and asked them to make change for a dollar. And whether they made change for a dollar is their measure of whether they helped or not. And they stopped these people either in front of a bakery or in front of a clothing store. And what they showed is that people were more likely to help when they were stopped in front of a bakery compared to when they were stopped in front of a clothing store. With the idea being that in front of a bakery, you've got all these pleasant smells that are coming out of that store. That puts people in a happy mood. Because we're in a happy mood, they're more likely to help. Or take this other study. This is a study done on college campuses. This was back when there were payphones on college campuses. You had to pay a dime in order to make a phone call. And the researchers rigged half of these payphones to randomly give people back their dime at the end of their call. So half the people got their dime back, half the people didn't. So after they make a phone call, they either get their dime back or not. They turn around and start walking away. And there's a woman with a bunch of folders there, and she accidentally drops her folders all over the ground. And the question is, will participants help this woman pick up her folders? And what they showed is that if these participants had just gotten their dime back from that phone call 30 seconds ago, they were much more likely to help this woman than if they had not gotten their dime back, which is a bit ridiculous, right? All that mattered is whether they got their dime back or not. But that was enough to make them happy. And because they were happy, they were more likely to help this woman pick up her folders. So happiness can increase our likelihood of helping. But it's not the only mood that does this. When we feel guilty, that also makes us more likely to help others because we really don't like that feeling of guilt. And one way to get rid of that feeling of guilt is to help someone else. That helps alleviate that negative feeling. So we're motivated to help others when we feel guilty, in other words. So, for example, researchers looked at religious people who were either going into confession or coming out of confession. And they asked them for some help on some task. Now, the idea being that people going into confession should have all their sins on their mind. They're thinking about all the ways in which they've sinned. They should feel guilty, right? But after they've been to confession and their sins have been absolved, they shouldn't feel guilty anymore coming out. So what the researchers showed is that people going into confession were more likely to help them than were people who were coming out of confession because they felt guiltier. Or in the second study, researchers stopped random people in a shopping mall and said, "Hey, could you help me with something? I just bought this new camera. Would you be willing to take a picture of me?" Everyone agrees to this. And so the participant takes the camera and they get the researcher in frame and they go to take the picture. And at that point, one of two things happens. For half the participants, they just take a picture normally. The researcher thanks them, takes the camera back, and they go on their way. For the other half of the people, when they go to take the picture, they press the shutter and nothing happens. No pictures taken. And the researcher says, "What did you do? I just bought that camera brand new. I spent a lot of money on it, and now I think you've broken my camera." "Well, thanks anyway." And they take their camera back. So now these participants are feeling really guilty, right? In their mind, they've just broken this person's camera. So they start walking away. And then there's this woman with all these folders again, and she drops the folders on the ground. And the question is, will these people help this woman pick up her folders? And what they showed is that people who thought they had just broken this other person's camera were much more likely to help this woman pick up her folders than people who were not led to believe they had broken this camera because they felt guilty about it. And one way to get rid of that guilty feeling was to help someone else. The attractiveness of the person in need of help also, unfortunately, matters as well. So, for example, to test whether this matters, what some researchers did is they created some application packages, like fake application packages to graduate schools. And they included in that application package a picture, supposedly, of the applicant. Now, in reality, all the application packages they created were identical except for the picture. Half of these application packages had a picture of a relatively attractive person, and the other half had a picture of a relatively unattractive person. They then took these application packages, put them on top of an envelope that was stamped and addressed, and left them at random locations around the city, like coffee shops and phone booths and airports and things like that. Now, what the researchers did is they addressed the envelopes to themselves. So they wanted to know when people come across this application package, it looks like someone accidentally left it out, right? And so the question is, will they help this person by taking the application package, putting it in the envelope, sealing it, dropping it in a mailbox? And so after a couple of weeks, the researchers can count up how many of these application packages had been returned to them. And what they found was that if the application package had been paired with a picture of a relatively attractive person, they were much more likely to have been returned. In other words, people were more willing to help an attractive person rather than an unattractive person. We're also more likely to help people who are similar to us. Again, a number of studies have demonstrated this. In fact, we already sort of know this because when we talked about the test where, or the study where Elaine was being shocked, supposedly, the manipulation that they used, if you remember, was a manipulation of how similar Elaine was to the person. And if Elaine was very similar to the participant, people were much more likely to help her than if she was not similar. Because similarity breeds empathy for people, and we help people that we're empathetic towards. Okay, so we are more likely to help people who are attractive and who are similar to us. We're also usually more likely to help our friends than strangers. Usually, not always. Because for certain tasks that are relevant to our ego, we're actually less likely to help our friends than strangers. So, for example, let's say that I play piano, and let's say that that's an important part of my self-concept. It's part of my ego. I'm a piano player, right? Well, if a stranger does better than me playing the piano, it's not a big deal as far as my ego is concerned, because there's always going to be someone that's better than me. But if a friend of mine outperforms me at piano, that makes me feel very uncomfortable because piano is my thing, right? As a consequence, when a task is relevant to my ego, I don't want my friends to succeed. And under those conditions, people have shown, researchers have shown, that people will sometimes sabotage their own friends' performance just to ensure their friends don't outperform them. So we're more likely to help strangers usually, or sorry, we're more likely to help friends usually, except when the task is relevant to our ego, in which case we're more likely to help strangers than we are friends. But the main factor that's been studied, and the one I'm going to end this lecture talking about, is the number of bystanders that are present during an emergency situation. Because you might think that if you were going to have a heart attack in a room, you would want as many people to be around as possible so that someone will do something to help, right? But if we think about the Kitty Genovese case, the woman who was stabbed and murdered outside her apartment complex, there were 38 people who saw or heard some part of the attack. And if you think about the Dalitha Word case, who was attacked on the bridge, there were 40 people who stood around and did nothing. And that led some social psychologists to think that maybe there's something else going on here. Maybe the counterintuitive, um, maybe there's something counterintuitive going on, right? Maybe it's the case that the more people that are present, the less likely people are to help. In other words, if you're going to have a heart attack, maybe it's better that you have a heart attack when there's only one other person in the room versus when there's 20 people in the room. Those two researchers, their names were Latané and Darley. And so they wanted to test this idea. So what they did is this. They had participants discuss an issue. So basically, these were college freshmen, and they were told that they're going to be discussing college life, how they're acclimating to college life. And they're told because it's a sensitive topic, they're going to be placed in these booths by themselves where there's headphones and a microphone. So they can't see the other people they're talking to. And they're led to believe that there's other people around campus in similar booths that are having this live conversation with them. And they think there's either one other person that they're talking with, there's two other people they're talking with, or there's five other people they're talking with. And so they start to have this conversation. They start talking about how they've adjusted to college life. And then a few minutes into that conversation, one of the participants has an epileptic seizure. Or at least that's what the one participant believes, right? They hear this one person have an epileptic seizure over their headphones. And in particular, what they hear is this. I could really use some help. So if somebody would give me a little help. Could somebody help? I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die. Help, a seizure. And then goes quiet. Clearly, someone's in need of help here, right? Now, this is all staged, of course, and the researchers want to know how long will it take people to leave the booth to go get the experimenter to tell them that something happened, that there's an emergency. How long will it take people to get help for this person? And will it depend on the number of other people they think are also listening in to this seizure? So remember, oops, if people thought that they were with one person, two people, or five people, and then one of them has a seizure, they now think they're either alone with one other person or with four other people. Okay, which is in the legend over here. So the first thing we're going to look at is the percentage of people who helped, who went to get the experimenter within 1 minute, as a function of how many other people they believed were also listening in on this seizure. Now, if people were alone, about 85% of them went to get help within a minute. If there was only one other bystander present, though, that number drops to only about 60%. And if the participant believed there were four other people who also heard the emergency, that number drops to only 30%. And if you look at the number of people or the percentage of people who helped within 2.5 minutes, you find the exact same pattern. If people are alone, every single one of them gets help within 2.5 minutes. If they believe there is one other bystander, then only about 80% of them go to get help. And if they believe there's four other bystanders, only about 60% of them went to get help. So we see the same pattern. What's happening is that the more people that are present during the emergency situation, the less likely the participant themselves is to get help. And that's known as the bystander effect. The finding that we are less likely to give help when there are more bystanders to a situation. So if you're going to have an emergency, in other words, it's better likely that you have an emergency in a room with only one other person than with 10 or 20 other people because of the bystander effect. The presence of bystanders inhibits our tendency to want to help others, which only raises the question as to why. Why does that happen? Well, there's really a number of reasons why this happens. So Latney and Darley, the two researchers who looked at this, they did a number of studies to create a model of helping. And what they said is that according to this model, there are 5 stages that a person has to get through in order to provide help to someone. But critically, at each one of these stages is an obstacle that can interfere with your ability to complete that stage. So I'm going to talk about what those 5 stages are and what the associated obstacles are for each of those stages. So first off, if we're going to provide help, the first thing we need to do is to notice that someone needs help in the first place. That's pretty obvious, right? You need to see that someone's in need of help if you're going to help them. The problem is that the presence of other people can often distract us. So the obstacle for each of these steps, I'm going to put in red. Okay. So distraction is the obstacle that gets in the way of noticing that someone is in need of help. And the more people that are present, the more distracting it is. And so the less likely we are to notice that someone needs help in the first place. So one of the reasons the bystander effect exists, not the only reason, but one of the reasons, is that other people distract us. They take our attention away from the person in need of help. If, for instance, someone had an emergency in this crowd, would you even notice? There's just so many people that it's easy to lose track of one person, right? If you're in a room with 100 people in let's say a classroom, a lecture hall, and someone has an emergency, you may not even notice because there's so many other people in the class. But if there's only one other person in the class, you're probably going to notice that that person is in need of help, right? So the first thing we need to do is to notice that someone is in need of help. Now, if we do that, if we've noticed that someone needs help, then the second thing we need to do is to interpret the event as an emergency. Because there's a lot of things that happen that are sort of ambiguous that we need to interpret. We need to understand what's going on. If we come across someone who's seemingly passed out on the beach, did they fall asleep? Are they drunk and they passed out? Do they have a heart attack? Like, we don't really know. We've got to interpret that somehow, right? The problem is the way that we interpret events can be systematically biased by various things. So remember that the general rule in social psychology is that when people are in a situation and they don't know what the correct behavior is, the first thing they do is they look to other people. What's everybody else doing? That's a general rule we've seen before in the conformity section, in the social proof section, when we talked about compliance, etc. And the same thing applies here. So let's say you come across this man downtown, right? And the question you're faced with is this a homeless person who's sleeping? Is it someone who has had a heart attack or some other emergency and you need to provide help? And you may not know how to interpret that situation. And so the first thing you do is you look around to other people. How's everybody else reacting to this person? Now, if no one else is panicking, then we assume that this is not an emergency. If it's an emergency, other people would be panicking, right? So if other people aren't panicking, we assume it's not an emergency. We don't panic. But the problem is, those other people are also looking to us to see how we're reacting, and we're not panicking, so they're not panicking, and they're not panicking, so we're not panicking. So no one panics, right? Even if there's a real emergency, because everyone's looking to everyone else to figure out what's happening, no one panics, and therefore everyone falsely concludes there's no emergency. Now, when we enter the state where there's a lot of people who all mistakenly conclude that there's no emergency, we say that we're in a state of pluralistic ignorance. Okay. In other words, even though we're behaving the exact same way as everybody else, right? We're not panicking, they're not panicking. We assume other people know something that we don't. We assume they know that this is not an emergency. But everyone assumes that everyone else knows that it's not an emergency, even when no one knows, right? So everyone can come to the false conclusion that there's no actual emergency, even though maybe there is. We see this in the Kitty Genovese case. When they were interviewing people in the apartment complex afterwards, some of the people said things like, I heard a fight, but I thought it was just a lover's quarrel. I didn't realize it was an actual attack. They misinterpreted the situation as something that wasn't an emergency when in fact it was. This was studied in an experiment where what researchers did is they had participants fill out questionnaires in a room, either by themselves or with like 6 or 7 other people in that room. A few minutes after they start filling in the survey, smoke starts coming in the room through a vent in the corner of the room. Now, for the people who are in a room where there's like 6 or 7 other people, those other people are confederates of the experimenter, and they've been instructed not to react in any way to the smoke that's coming in through the vent. And so the researchers want to know, how long is it going to take the one real participant to get help? And is it going to depend on whether there's other people in the room or not? And so what they showed is that when people are by themselves, when they see the smoke come through the vent, they think, well, I better get someone. So they leave the room and they get help pretty quickly. But when people are in a room with other people, the first thing they do when they see the smoke is they look to other people. Is anyone else reacting to this? And they're not reacting. So the participant thinks, well, I guess maybe there's nothing going on here. So they continue to fill out the questionnaire. And a minute or two later, they're still thinking like, are we sure this isn't an emergency? And still no one's reacting. So they think, well, I guess maybe there's not an emergency. And they continue filling up the questionnaires. And as a consequence, when people are in these rooms with other people who are not reacting, the smoke keeps billowing in the room and no one's doing anything. In fact, in some of these participants, the smoke got so thick they couldn't even see their questionnaires. They were like trying to wave the smoke away from their questionnaires, but they still weren't leaving the room to get help because they were in the state of pluralistic ignorance. They assumed that everybody else knew that this was not an emergency and therefore they didn't need to get help themselves. This is James Bulger. When James Bulger was 2, he was abducted from a shopping mall. He was led away by 2 people. This is a security cam shot of one of those 2 people leading little James Bulger away. And James was crying and trying to get away as he's being led out of the shopping mall. But these 2 people, his 2 abductors, took him outside the shopping mall and took him on a walk through the woods in behind the mall. It was like 2 miles that they took him on. And in the middle of the woods, they started beating him, like kicking him and punching him. They started throwing rocks at him. In fact, they beat him so hard that they ended up killing James Bulger in the woods. And they decided that to get away with their crime, they're going to take his body and place it on some railroad tracks, weigh his head down with rubble, and therefore, when the next train came in, the train would hit his body and people would think the train killed him. It's a pretty awful murder, right? If it's not awful enough, there's 2 particularly surprising things about this case. The first surprising thing is that his 2 abductors were both 10 years old. And the second surprising thing is that in an eerie coincidence with the Kitty Genovese case, when they did an investigation afterwards to try to find out who saw what, they discovered that 38 people, the same number in the Genovese case, 38 people had witnessed James Bulger being taken away by these boys and no one did anything to help. Well, why not? Because this was an ambiguous situation, right? I mean, these people are seeing a little boy, 2 years old, being led away by two older boys, and he's crying and trying to get away. And people might be thinking, like, is this a situation? Is this an emergency or not? And they're thinking, well, no one else is reacting to this, so I guess it's no big deal. It's probably a boy having a tantrum, and his older brothers are leading him away or something, right? So everyone falsely concluded there was no emergency. They were in a state of pluralistic ignorance. And as a consequence, James Bulger died that day. So that was the second step to helping, is interpreting the event as an emergency. But let's say we've gotten past that step. We've noticed the emergency. We've interpreted it correctly as an emergency. The third step to helping is that we need to take responsibility to provide help to the person in need. Now, if you're alone, if you're in a room with one person who has a heart attack or something, you're probably going to feel responsible for helping them because you know there's no one else that can do it, right? So you better call 911 pretty quickly. But if you're in a room where there's like 100 other people and someone has a heart attack, it doesn't feel like you're responsible as much, right? There's other people. Other people could do something as well. So everyone places the responsibility on everybody else, and as a consequence, no one person feels a need, feels that responsibility themselves to provide help. In other words, what's happening here is something known as the diffusion of responsibility. The belief that other people should take responsibility to provide help instead of me. Their responsibility gets diffused among all of the people who are in the room, in other words. Okay, so you can see how the more people that are present, the more diffusion of responsibility occurs, the less individually responsible any one person feels. And you see this in the Kitty Genovese case as well. When investigators were interviewing some of the people who lived in the apartment complex, some of them said things like, well, I was going to call the police, but I figured that someone else had already done it by now. They didn't feel responsible because they assumed someone else did it. And everybody assumed someone else did it, so no one did anything. Let's say we've gotten past that stage. Okay. So we've taken responsibility to provide help. The fourth step to helping is we have to know what to do. You have to know how to help. Some situations might be easy. You can call 911, right? But some situations might be trickier. What if someone's choking and you don't know the Heimlich maneuver? You may not know what to do in that situation. Now, the thing is, if you're by yourself and someone's choking, even if you don't know the Heimlich maneuver, you better try something, right? You're going to try because there's no other option. But if you're in a group of 20 other people, you might assume, well, you don't know how to help. You assume someone else knows how to help better than you. And so you're less likely to help because you assume someone else has more knowledge than you do. Now, fortunately, in this day and age, because we all have cell phones, we can at the very least call someone. But nonetheless, what's happening here, the obstacle that's getting in the way of completing the step is that we feel like we don't have the competence to help someone. We feel there's a lack of competence here. So if we feel we lack the ability to help someone, we're going to be less likely to help, obviously. This is why people like nurses, firefighters, EMTs, these trained professionals are less likely to fall prey to the bystander effect. They're more likely to provide help because they know what to do. Okay. So you can see that the bystander effect is partly a function as well of the fact that the more people are present, the greater the likelihood that someone else has expertise in how to help. So you can see so far that there's a multitude of reasons for the bystander effect because the number of bystanders can interfere with our ability to complete each of these steps. And the same is going to be true of the fifth step as well. Because let's say that we know how to help. Okay. We've noticed the emergency. We've interpreted it as an emergency. We've taken responsibility to help. We know how to help, but we still may not because there's a fifth step we have to get through. And that is the fact that we have to decide to actually help. The thing is that the presence of an audience can inhibit our decision to provide help. Therefore, the obstacle is known as audience inhibition. This is the stage where these social exchange theorist ideas come into play. So at the beginning of the lecture, when I talked about social exchange theory, I said that we will help when the rewards outweigh the costs. The problem is the presence of other people can increase the perceived costs associated with helping. Because it's embarrassing if you give mouth to someone and they had only been sleeping, right? That's embarrassing. But it's even more embarrassing if 100 people see you do that, right? There's more potential embarrassment if you're wrong, if you do something wrong, right? As a consequence, the presence of other people can increase the associated costs with helping and therefore change that calculus and therefore make us less likely to help because this is the stage where social exchange theory is occurring. Okay. In other words, this is the stage where we're considering the rewards and the costs associated with helping. And so again, we can see the more people that are present, the less likely an individual is to help, in part because the presence of those other people increase the costs with helping. And so what was happening in all of these cases where there's all these bystanders and no one's doing anything to help is that these people were inhibited from helping, not because they were people who didn't care. They weren't unempathetic. They didn't like not care about other people's lives. It's just that their behavior was inhibited because they didn't notice the event or they interpreted it incorrectly as not being an emergency, or they didn't feel personally responsible, or they didn't feel like they knew how to help, or they were inhibited by helping from the presence of the audience. Those weren't bad people in the Kitty Genovese case of the Talitha Ward case who didn't provide help. They were just inhibited by the situation. And so in the textbook, these are the 5 steps to helping. This is a diagram taken from the textbook. So if you want to see them all on one spot, here you go. And you can see that for each one of these 5 steps is the obstacle that's associated with that step that can keep people from helping. And so the question is, what can we do to increase helping, right? Well, just being aware of these obstacles to helping can increase our likelihood of helping. Just the fact that you have sat through this lecture means you're more likely to help in an emergency situation than you were before you sat through this lecture, because you should be aware now of the fact that maybe you're misinterpreting a situation, or maybe you don't feel personally responsible for helping or whatever, right? And studies have shown this, that people who are aware of these 5 steps to helping and the obstacles that gets in the way with each one, they're more likely to help themselves than people who are not aware of these things. And furthermore, if you're the person in need of help, you want to make sure that other people don't fall into these obstacles as well. So, for example, you should make it very clear that you need help. In other words, that'll make sure that people notice you, first step to helping, and it'll make sure they interpret the situation correctly. If you make it exactly clear, hey, I need help, here's what I need, people can't misinterpret that situation. They know what to do at that point. And furthermore, instead of just saying, somebody help me, by saying somebody help me, that's going to lead to a diffusion of responsibility. No one's going to feel personally responsible. So singling someone out, pointing to someone and saying, you call 911 or you do this or whatever, that gets people past that diffusion of responsibility, that makes them feel personally responsible for helping. Okay, well, that is it. Congratulations, you have now completed a course on Introduction to Social Psychology, and I'm hoping that you found the course at least somewhat enlightening about some of the causes of human behavior. And I hope that you are able to use some of what you've learned here in your own day-to-day lives. I wish you the best of luck.